This woman, Joy Hips, was found in her son's bedroom, not killed by the fire that engulfed her home, but by violent means before the blaze even started. Stabbed, strangled, and then set ablaze in a chilling act of deception. Who would go to such lengths to cover up murder? Joy Hips was born on September 23, 1955, in Chiefland, Florida. The youngest of 9, she grew up surrounded by family, cherishing the outdoor life of her rural upbringing. She was an avid hiker, fisher, and sports enthusiast, with a particular love for football and running. In addition, she was actively involved in sports, enjoying running during her school years and participating in various competitions. Joy also loved football and tried her best not to miss a single game of her favorite teams. While Joy was in high school, she met a boy named Charlie, and shortly after graduation, they got married. Following the wedding, the couple decided to move to Pennsylvania, settling in a small town called Croydon. Joy wanted to work in the medical field, but without the proper education, she only got support roles. She worked as a veterinary assistant for some time before deciding to enroll in a local college. There, she earned a medical degree and became a physical therapist in a small clinic near her home. In 1975, when Joy was 20, she and Charlie had a daughter, and 3 years later, a son. The family settled in a nice, quiet neighborhood, leading a peaceful and happy life. For their friends and relatives, it looked as though Joy and Charlie had created the perfect family that fully embodied the American dream. Everything continued like this until April 19, 1991. On that fateful day, Joy sent her children off to school, the start of what should have been just another normal day, and began preparing for her shift. She also went grocery shopping, stopping by the bank beforehand to cash a check. Around 1 p.m., her son, who was 12 at the time, came home from school and saw his mother's car parked outside the house. That day, he had received good grades and rushed inside to share the news with his mom. However, his joy soon turned to worry. Approaching the window, he saw thick smoke inside. At first, the boy thought his mom had left something on the stove, but as soon as he opened the door, he saw flames engulfing the house. He began to panic and tried to get inside to find his mom, but the smoke and fire made it impossible. Meanwhile, neighbors noticed what was happening and called the firefighters. They managed to quickly extinguish the flames, but in the last room, the boy's bedroom, the firefighters found a human body. The doctors and police who arrived at the scene immediately suspected that the deceased was Joy, but it was difficult to identify her with absolute certainty due to the severe burns, so the body was handed over to medical experts. Meanwhile, news of the fire spread quickly throughout the town. Joy's daughter, who was at school at the time, heard about the incident and came home, where she saw her crying brother. Soon, Joy's husband arrived at the scene and fainted as soon as the police informed him about the body they had found. At that moment, the firefighters were still investigating the causes of the fire. However, Joy's son immediately began blaming himself for what had happened. He had a home computer, and all the wires were messily plugged into one shared socket near the aquarium. Considering that the woman's body was found in his room, he instantly thought the fire had started due to his negligence, and that his mother had tried to extinguish it. However, what they discovered went beyond a simple house fire. The firefighters noticed suspicious details right away, signs that this might be more than an accident. It looked as if the fire had started in different parts of the house, which is almost impossible in an accidental fire. A thorough examination of the house confirmed this suspicion. There were 4 separate points from where the fire had started. Although the exact cause of the fire couldn't be determined, one thing was undoubtedly clear. The house caught fire due to deliberate arson. Moreover, all 4 gas burners in the kitchen were turned on, with traces of some kind of debris on them. This indicated that the arsonist had used flammable materials to spread the fire from the stove to other places. This arson theory was soon confirmed by the medical experts' report. First, they positively identified the deceased as Joy. Secondly, the most chilling discovery was the body of Joy Hipps, found in her son's bedroom, not killed by the fire, but by violent means before the blaze started. An autopsy later confirmed that Joy had been stabbed multiple times and likely strangled. The fire was an attempt to cover up this heinous act. Consequently, the case was classified as murder, and investigators began searching for any clues. However, this task proved to be quite challenging. The problem was that the fire had severely damaged the house, making it difficult to find any leads. There were no traces of foreign DNA on the victim's body either, so the detectives focused on potential suspects. Their first suspect was her husband. Although he was at work during the fire, the police didn't rule out the possibility that he could have driven home and back to create an alibi. Nevertheless, they found no evidence indicating serious problems in their marriage. All relatives and acquaintances stated that the couple was genuinely happy, and Charlie himself seemed genuinely devastated after his wife's death. Despite this, detectives continued to evaluate him as a suspect, but ultimately concluded that he was most likely not involved. They also asked Joy's acquaintances if she had any conflicts or if anyone might have wished her harm. Everyone repeated that she never quarreled with anyone and was a very kind person. Additionally, the investigators considered the possibility that Joy could have been an unintended victim. From her husband, they learned that she used to cash a bank check every Friday, and she should have had cash on the day of the incident. However, her wallet, which was found on the couch in the house, was empty. As for her handbag, it was apparent that someone had emptied its contents on the kitchen floor, as if the perpetrator was looking for something specific. The police didn't rule out the idea that someone might have followed her from the bank to her home, or that the house was simply broken into with the intent to rob it. Yet, this theory also seemed doubtful because, besides a relatively small amount of cash, nothing else was missing from the house. All valuable items remained in place, making the random robbery theory rather weak. Thus, the investigators leaned towards the theory of a targeted attack and soon discovered some intriguing facts. Joy's relatives shared that she had experienced a series of unpleasant incidents over the last few months. Once, someone threw a brick through their house window. On another occasion, an unknown person damaged their door and also slashed the tires of the woman's car while it was parked near the garage. At that time, Joy and Charlie thought it was the work of some vandals who had randomly chosen their house. But now, after the murder, all these incidents seemed related. The police tried to figure out who could be behind all these events and questioned Joy's neighbors. They said they hadn't seen anything suspicious near the family's house at the time of those incidents, but shared another interesting observation. According to the neighbors, shortly before the fire started, they saw a blue Monte Carlo sedan in front of Joy's house. The neighbors noticed this car because it was parked quite strangely, but none of them saw the driver. Detectives asked Joy's relatives if they knew the owner of this car, and here they found their first significant lead. Joy's son recalled that a friend of his mother named April sometimes visited them in a similar car. Digging deeper, the police discovered that April and her husband lived just a few houses away from Joy, but they lost their home due to debts and moved shortly before the incident. According to Joy's acquaintances, she and April became friends soon after the move, and since then, April often visited Joy with her children. However, April's relationship with her husband, Robert, seemed problematic. Neighbors reported that Robert often behaved aggressively and physically abused his wife. This was why April spent a lot of time at Joy's house, trying to avoid problems at her own home. Joy's son also told detectives that Robert apparently had some conflict with his mother. He once overheard his mother talking to Robert on the phone, and Robert not only yelled at her, but also openly threatened her. The police began investigating Robert and quickly found that he had a significant criminal history, mostly related to illegal substances. Given all this, the investigators started seriously considering his involvement. They speculated that Robert might have had a conflict with Joy because she helped his wife, and ultimately, this animosity pushed him to commit murder. The police contacted their colleagues in the narcotics department, who had interacted with Robert multiple times, to learn more about him. The officers agreed to help and offered to talk to him, as they knew him well from years of various investigations. However, Robert claimed he had nothing to do with the crime. He said he spent the entire weekend in another city on vacation with his wife and children. However, considering that the murder happened on a Friday afternoon, he theoretically had the opportunity to drive to Joy's house and then leave the city for the vacation. Another curious detail was that during the conversation, the police noticed a fresh scratch on his hand, but Robert continued to insist on his innocence. In the following days, Robert refused to talk to the investigators, citing advice from his lawyer. The detectives also tried to convince him to take a polygraph test, but Robert continued to refuse to cooperate. The police then focused on finding possible evidence that could link Robert to the murder. Since they still couldn't find any leads in the house, they went back to the neighbors who had seen the blue car near Joy's house and took them to Robert's house. The police hoped the neighbors could identify the car, but they faced an unexpected and unpleasant twist. Firstly, Robert's Monte Carlo sedan was black, not blue. Secondly, the neighbors said it wasn't the car they saw near the victim's house. Additionally, detectives checked Robert's alibi and confirmed that the family did indeed check into a hotel in another city that Friday. Moreover, before leaving home, Robert had a phone conversation with his wife's friend, and this call happened at the exact time Joy was killed. All this evidence led the police to reconsider Robert as the main suspect and shift their focus to finding other leads. With no other options left, they decided to take another look at the victim's husband. This time, investigators found something interesting. Talking to Joy's co-workers, they learned that Joy had been receiving threatening phone calls. One colleague even suspected that the caller was Joy's husband, though she never asked Joy for details. Despite all this, Charlie had a solid alibi. Several colleagues confirmed his presence at work on that day. However, investigators didn't rule out the possibility that he could have somehow made it home to commit the murder. In the following months, they continued to summon him to the station, conduct multiple polygraph tests, but nothing in Charlie's behavior suggested his involvement. Additionally, Charlie had no criminal history, nor any hints that he might have been aggressive toward his wife throughout their marriage. Ultimately, the police concluded that his involvement seemed unlikely, and since then, there have been practically no developments in the case. Without any significant evidence to point to specific suspects, the police couldn't make any progress, and Joy's case was shelved for a long time. Occasionally, they attempted to revisit it, but each attempt led nowhere. This continued for several decades, by which time Joy's children had grown up, and the lack of progress in their mother's murder investigation troubled them. Joy's son periodically tried to reach out to the police to urge for a full reinvestigation, but each time his requests were futile. During one conversation with detectives, he was told that they still suspected his father, but couldn't prove it. In 2014, 23 years after the murder, Joy's case got a new chance. It was handed over to the Cold Case Unit, and a new team of detectives started investigating all the available evidence from scratch. They soon began to notice some oddities that permeated this case. Investigators found out that almost all communication with Robert, one of the main suspects, had been through the narcotics department officers. This wasn't just strange, it was outright unprofessional. They were dealing with a murder investigation, so the new detectives didn't understand the high degree of involvement from a completely unrelated department. They decided to speak with one of the detectives who worked on the case in 1991. Initially, he refused to discuss Joy's murder, but after several attempts, they managed to persuade him to answer their questions. What he revealed shook the investigators. He claimed that Robert seemed the most likely suspect from the early weeks of the investigation, but there was a problem. They were ordered to stay away from Robert and not pursue his involvement in the murder because he was an informant for the narcotics department. The police knew back then that Robert was an informant, but they thought it shouldn't conflict with the murder investigation. In reality, Robert was a key informant in a major case, so the police department leadership didn't want to risk the years-long drug investigation. As a result, the original team of investigators didn't seriously try to prove Robert's involvement and conducted a superficial investigation instead. These revelations marked a turning point in Joy's case, and the new team of detectives began searching for evidence against Robert. In 1991, the police concluded that Robert had a solid alibi. The new investigators realized they couldn't rely on old documents and started checking this information themselves. First, they contacted Robert's wife's friend, who supposedly had a phone conversation with Robert at the time of Joy's murder. The woman confirmed that the conversation indeed took place, but clarified that they spoke not in the afternoon, but closer to the evening. The police then re-interviewed the witnesses who saw Robert with his wife and children when they checked into the hotel. Based on case materials, they checked in after lunch, but this time the witnesses contradicted that information. They said the family actually arrived at the hotel around 5 p.m., meaning Robert had time to commit the crime. Finally, the detectives decided to talk to April. By that time, April and Robert had already divorced, but she continued to insist on the truthfulness of his alibi, which claimed he had no time to commit the murder. The police tried talking to her several times, but she stuck to her original statements. Thus, the detectives shifted their focus to finding other leads and re-examining all the existing evidence. This process stretched over several years until something unexpected happened. In 2016, April came to the police station and said she wanted to talk. She explained that several negative events in her life over the past few years had made her reconsider her position on Joy's murder case. April admitted that she had lied about her ex-husband's alibi all these years, and in reality, things happened quite differently. She said that on that day, Robert came home covered in bloodstains. When she asked what had happened, he replied, "I stabbed someone and set the house on fire." He then demanded that she pack up the children for a trip, and they went to another city under the pretext of a weekend getaway. Robert took a bag with him, and when they went for a walk in the park, he left the children and his wife to go into the woods, returning without the bag. April realized that her husband had killed Joy only a few days later when detectives came to their home. She then demanded that he go to the police and confess, but he beat her and threatened to frame her for the crime. Thus, she had been afraid to testify against Robert all these years, but she finally decided to do the right thing. April's testimony fundamentally changed the course of the case, but the detectives knew they still needed some evidence or a confession. They decided to conduct a rather complex operation and asked April to help them prove her ex-husband's involvement. They wired her with a listening device and staged a scene where a group of police officers came to her house. Afterward, April called her ex-husband and told him the detectives had just come to her with questions about Joy's murder, and she didn't know what to do. Robert immediately demanded that she refuse to talk to the police and not answer their questions. Based on their conversation, there was no hint that the man might be innocent. Every sentence he uttered indicated that he was trying to avoid responsibility. With this recording, the detectives began preparing the case for trial alongside the prosecution. This process took several years, and only in May 2022 was Robert finally arrested. He continued to deny his guilt, but the district attorney assessed the chances of securing a conviction as very high. April was the main witness in this case, and everything continued until another unexpected twist occurred. When Robert's son was called to testify in court, he suddenly stated that his father had confessed to the murder. According to the man, Robert called him shortly after that phone conversation with his ex-wife. He said that the police were questioning her about the murder and he might soon be sentenced to life imprisonment. Robert added that he wanted to prepare him for such an outcome, and then began recounting the details of the crime. He didn't directly confess to Joy's murder, but used phrases like, "I think I did it." This testimony strengthened an already strong case. But one of the main questions for the prosecution remains: what was Robert's motive? Based on all the available information, the man had long been in conflict with the woman and had a tendency towards aggressive behavior and committing crimes. Moreover, he apparently took the cash that Joey had withdrawn from the bank a few hours before her death. However, there was another, much darker version. When new shocking details emerged in this case and major TV channels started talking about it again, detectives were contacted by Robert's relatives from another state. They explained that they had not communicated with him for a long time, but they were literally shocked by Joey's photo in the news. The fact was that Robert, as a teenager, had abused his aunt and beaten her, and this aunt looked incredibly similar to Joey. Thus, the detectives assumed that Robert might have attacked Joey, including with the intent of assault, although it was already impossible to establish this for sure. Despite this, the jury found Robert guilty of Joey's murder, and the man was sentenced to life imprisonment. Although justice was ultimately served in this case, its details caused quite justified outrage. Robert lived freely for more than 30 years since the murder, and one of the main reasons was that the police did not want to harm the narcotics department's investigation. Thus, Joey's life was effectively valued less than the drug trafficking case. Despite this, the woman's relatives thanked the new team of detectives for their work. Her son had been wondering for many years about his father's involvement, as this idea had been planted in him by the old investigators, but in the end, he finally learned the truth. What do you think about this story? Leave your thoughts below. And if you're passionate about uncovering the truth in true crime cases, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. Remember, staying informed is the first step to justice. Join our Telegram channel for daily updates on crime news from around the globe. Together, let's keep the conversation going and never stop seeking the truth.